So right now I'm putting my pencil on the paper just to try and determine that's kind of the way I start all the time, figuring out about how high my horizon line should be. And I start my paintings very lightly. So I apologize if you can't see the pencil marks that clearly right now on your screen. I'll darken them up later, but I'm just making sure that everything is going to be where I need it to be before I darken up the pencil marks. So if I need to change anything, I don't have to erase, dark pencil lines. So I always start this way, very lightly, just kind of get an idea. Where's my horizon line? Where are the little farm buildings and silos? Where's that puddle of ice going to be? And place those objects first, and then I'll tighten up the drawing a little bit. I'm just using a number 2 pencil. My paper is Saunders 140-pound rough. I used to paint more on 300-pound paper. I haven't painted on 300-pound paper in a long, long time. I like this Saunders 140-pound more and more. 300-pound paper is so absorbent, and that's one thing that's kind of changed in my style, I think, as I've painted more. I like the softness of being able to work wet into wet in a lot of my shapes. I just kind of keep working on the painting as the paper is drying. And that 300-pound paper, like I said, is so absorbent that you'd have to kind of keep wetting it all the time to try and get more of those soft edges. So I prefer the 140-pound paper now. Everybody can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I hope the sound was good. So now that I know where everything is, now I'm going in and darkening up my pencil lines. And again, there's not a lot that I have to really draw in this scene. That's why I chose something that I can hopefully get close to finishing in this hour. I'm adding a little grain elevator or something off to the right side just to have another little spot of interest out there. This is just down the road from where I live. I've kind of been enjoying sometimes I feel bad saying that, but this forced isolation we've been through, unfortunately, I mean, I'm very lucky that I've been asked to travel and teach and stuff as much as I have been. That's what we all strive for, to get invitations for some of these things. But the last several years has seen me sleeping in hotel beds more than my own bed, and so it's kind of been nice for me to be home more. And I've been enjoying painting a lot of scenes around Vermilion lately and getting to know my hometown even better. So after I darken up the pencil lines, I take that kneaded eraser and just kind of get rid of some of those light initial block-in lines. I can't get rid of all of the graphite, but I try to get enough of it so it doesn't smear too much when I wet the paper. So I wet both the front and the back, and I like to use a sponge to wet the paper. If you use a big mop brush, even with a big brush, it takes longer to cover it. Look how fast I can, with a sponge, I can cover that whole paper. But I also, you see me right now wetting it and squeezing it out. So I can go over it once with kind of a wet sponge, and then I go over it again after I've squeezed it out, and it actually takes some of that water off. I just want my paper damp. Okay, I don't want it sopping wet with the puddles of water sitting on it. So this allows me to wet it fast and make sure I can keep working on it. It's not going to take forever to dry on me. So there's that little area that I'm going to kind of leave close to white paper where the sun burst is through on the very right side. But I'm still basically wetting the whole paper. I'm not going to leave that, dry white paper too much. It might be a little hard edged by the time I get in there, but I think that's more a function of the camera and getting, those high shifts in value and stuff. So I'm going to start with the golds and the yellows of that sky, that cadmium lemon that's right there by the sunburst, and it slowly goes down as it gets away from the sun. It's going to start turning more kind of quinacridone gold and orange down at the bottom. So I'll go from cadmium lemon to orange, maybe raw sienna up here, And then people ask this all the time, how do you go from yellow to blue without it turning green? And I'll probably just put a little bit of like some lavender or pink or something as a transitional color to go from the yellow to the blue. And then I have to make sure I'm carrying that down into that reflective puddle also, the warm sky. I don't have to worry about any of the snow, the land, all that stuff is going to be so much darker later. So when I do this wash, it'll kind of continue right on through. I'll paint right through all that. So that's kind of a cadmium lemon. It probably looks a little more green on the screen than it actually is. It is the cool yellow, obviously. The cadmium lemon's a little bit more towards green than red, but I think it looks a little bit more green on this screen than it actually is. Every once in a while, I think I record these too so I can preserve the steps. So sorry about that. You'll see me just kind of take a picture once in a while of this. I like to have some of those steps recorded. So I pause once in a while and take a photo. All right, so I'm going to start adding some quinacridone gold as I get away. So again, that area right by where the sun was is white paper. And now I'm going to start, as I go away from there, just start trying to warm it up a bit more. That seemed to be a little bit too brown, so I'm going to try and get it a little bit more orangey than brown here as I'm continuing over. See, every time I rinse my brush, I have to go to that sponge. Those big mop brushes hold so much water. That goes back to what I was saying about using your brush to even wet the paper. It just kind of holds too much. So every time I rinse it, I have a sponge there ready to dab it off a little bit first. Excuse me. So there's some nice orange there. Now that looks way too dark, obviously. But you have to remember this first wash. I mean, we all know watercolor fades as it dries, right? As it lightens. And so this first wash, these are the colors that I use the most water in, to lighten these colors. I have to add a lot of water to it. So these puddles have a little bit of pigment and a lot of water. Plus I wet my paper first. So this first wash has a lot of drying to do, which means it's going to fade more than any other wash during the course of the painting. Obviously, as I go and I'm getting darker and darker, I'm using less water and more paint in my washes, and they won't fade quite as much. The darks don't fade much at all. It's almost pure pigment. So it's tricky because for this first wash, all you're comparing it to is the white paper. So no matter what you put on there, it looks too dark. And it takes a while for a lot of my students to kind of figure out how to go dark enough on this first wash so that they're not disappointed, 2 hours from now when it's dry, that they have to go over it again. And you don't want to have to paint your sky twice. That needs to be, kind of a one-shot go while the paper is wet, and hopefully you nail it. You can wet it again and add some stuff, but I definitely prefer to work on it once and be done with it. So you can see now I'm starting to add some alizarin crimson and cerulean blue just to slowly kind of transition from yellows and golds to that stripe of blue up in the top left of the sky there. Just kind of, my paper is still damp. I'm able to keep coming in and push this around. I'm not going to get too many hard edges, hopefully, if I remember correctly. Carried all the way down to the bottom of the sky. Pretty soon I'll have to come in and get some of that cerulean blue in so I don't get a hard edge up there, but I think I wetted enough so it should be safe. And I'm gonna have to carry that down into my puddle pretty soon too here and make sure I'm getting whatever I'm painting in the sky is reflecting below it. So I may as well just continue that right down through the land into the puddle and make sure I'm getting that same, those colors are similar to what's in the sky above it. So and again, I wet that whole area down there. I'll paint the shape in the puddle first, but I don't want to paint too much around it as far as the snow yet. I don't want that to bleed in there. So I'll paint the shape of the puddle for now and then just kind of stay away from there for a little bit anyways, before I start dropping in some, even if it's pale colors, lavenders and stuff. I want to make sure I'm getting that nice yellowy glow in there. I'm keep adding, some of these brush strokes, these big fluid brush strokes, to make sure things are still staying damp and fuzzing a little bit. You're not seeing blooms because the whole thing is still fairly wet. Okay, you get blossoms when things are starting to dry too much, and you come in with something too wet. That's when it starts creeping and creating problems. But remember, the back of my paper was damp, the front was wet. My puddles are wet. If I picked up that sheet of paper, it would be very limp. It would be um, it's far from dry yet. So I can keep coming in with this big brush and kind of pushing things around, getting the colors I want. So now I can start putting that blue in there and not worry about it turning green, because I've had a little bit of the some pink colors in there for that transition. I'll hold off just a little bit before I put in some of those scudding clouds in there. But right where the buildings are, I just put a little strip of blue there. You can see my pencil marks. Most of those buildings, if I leave anything light on those buildings, you have to be careful. I mean, look at those buildings and look at the snow on the ground around the puddle and compare them to the white border of that photograph. Look how dark, if you squint a little bit, look how dark that snow is. Okay, that's the difficult part about all this. Your brain is telling you that snow is white, and I know that those farm buildings are white also. But if you squint a little bit, you really see the value of them. Okay, you've got to make sure, if you're trying to get this sunset to look bright, you've got to get the dark enough on the land and the buildings so that it really pops out the sky.
Andy, Angela
Yeah.
she's got her hand up. You want to
Okay.
unmute? And
Yep. Unmute yourself and ask. I'll pause it. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask? Or if it's in the chat, Marietta, you can read it. I can't see the chat because I'm screen sharing. Sorry.
in the chat, but that's okay. We'll keep going, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, if you've got a question, just go ahead and unmute and I'll answer you. So I'm using this Chinese brush right now to lift off some of those lights. If I paint around some of those white clouds, they're going to be too harsh. Okay, so I included them in this light wash, and then now I'm going to take that kind of oxhair Chinese brush and lift off some of the light, so it'll be a little bit lighter, but it won't be the white of the paper up there. I love those Chinese brushes. I paint with them more and more. They don't hold a lot of water and paint. They're not even close to what like a squirrel mop or a sable does, but I like the shapes that you can paint with them. They're fun. So I've got the warm glow in the sky. I've got it reflecting down into the puddle. Pretty soon it's going to be time to start introducing some color down in that big cloud bank, and then down around the puddle. The puddle isn't just one flat color. I'm going to start dropping in a little bit of warmer golds at the top of it, especially where you're maybe seeing some of the dirt above and some of those little corn stalks and stuff reflecting in. So I'm just dropping in a little bit of darker color here now. And then pretty soon I'll just start filling in the rest of the white paper around it. But I wanted to make sure that top of that puddle had a little bit more color and value on it.
So Andy, this is Carol, and I have a question, if you can hear me.
Yep, I can.
Yeah, so you were talking about, that you're using a Chinese brush to kind of lift up some of the color. Do you find that there's certain kinds of brushes that are better for lifting your color than others?
Yeah, so good question. So I would either use a synthetic brush or, those, like I said, that Chinese brush. It's a natural hair brush, but it's more like ox hair, so it's more stiff. When I'm lifting, you kind of have to push down on the paper, to really lift that paint and water off. And sable brushes and squirrel brushes are too soft to do that. You know what I mean? So if I'm lifting, if I want to get a light streak on a road or something, I would either use a synthetic brush, like a size 10 or 12 synthetic, or like I said, this Chinese brush is good too, because the bristles are just a little bit more stiff. I think you want that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So now you can see, I mean, the paper's still wet. I just took that brush and I can kind of fuzz that puddle. So now I'm just going to start, even though I have to paint over this obviously later, much darker, that snow. I don't want to leave white paper there and get some weird hard edges. So in my first wash, I'm just covering everything. So even though, like I said, later on, I'm going to have to cover that up with much darker blues and violets and grays, I'm still going to include it in this wash. I'm trying to see the shape of that puddle, so I'm not coming too far into it with these violets. I try and give myself maybe, you know, a 1/4 inch of space around it. So it'll fuzz a little bit, but it won't start bleeding too much into that yellow puddle. And again, when you look at the two, if you look at the photograph and you look at my painting, my yellow looks way too dark, but all you're comparing it to is other light colors and white paper. Okay. It hasn't dried, it hasn't lightened and faded. And I don't have any of those middle value and dark colors on my painting yet. So um, you just kind of learn to adjust for that as you go. That's a big thing. I think that people have to figure out when they first start painting in watercolors, how much everything fades and lightens. Another photograph here for posterity. So pretty soon I've got to get up and get that cloud in. I don't want that to be too hard edged on the bottom. But I was able to lift some of that paint off, so I know it was still okay. There's a little bit of warmth on the bottom of that cloud, where it's catching some of the rim of the sunset is bouncing off of the bottom of it. So I don't want it to just be blue and then go right into what I had there before. So right now I'm just coming in with a little bit of warmer color at the bottom of that big cloud bank. Make sure I've got that on there first. I use cerulean blue a lot lately. You see me going to that over a lot of my other blues. I like it. It's a little bit more opaque. It's a little bit more granular. And the other blues are so intense, ultramarine and stuff. I don't need it to get that quite that purple. And cerulean blue is just a little bit, and that color in the corner is lavender, made by Holbein, and that also has some white in it. It's kind of a, you can almost see it in that well down there. It's a little bit of a chalky color, opaque, and I like that one too. So I use a lot of, in my skies and snow scenes and stuff, I really like to use lavender and cerulean blue quite a bit. Most of my colors are Winsor Newton, but that lavender and my raw sienna are Holbein. Winsor Newton's raw sienna got really bad over the last few years. I don't know what they did. I used to use it, but they changed the formula, and it just I didn't like the color of it anymore. So I'm starting to drop in just a little bit darker. You know, if that fuzz is in the distance, the distant land, that's fine. Obviously, it's not close to dark enough to be in those trees and stuff, but just starting to drop it in. I know there's no reflection of the barn in that puddle, but I'm going to take some artistic license and just drop it in there, just because no one's going to really know, and just to help break the shape of that puddle up a little bit and add a little bit of visual interest. It would be nice if there was a reflection in there. So, and I'd like it to be a little bit softer. It's quite a ways away. I don't want it to be too harsh. So again, maybe that's not realistic that something that far away would be reflecting in, but no one's the wiser. I trust that none of you will tell anyone. Okay, look how soft all that is. For as much as I was, you know, kind of pushing things around with my brush and all that, the colors aren't getting too muddy. I didn't come back over things too much. I can't wait too much longer before I put in a couple of those little darker clouds, especially that little kind of brownish gold one in front of the sunset. Hopefully I remember to do that soon. So now my table isn't tilted much, but it's tilted a little bit. I don't want, if I paint this dark sky, I don't want it to run down into the lighter areas. If anything, I'd rather have it, the light stuff creep up. So I'm turning my paper upside down now, and I'm using, I'm going to start with some warmer colors at the bottom of it. Again, I put that little bit of gold there. It's not, before I go to blues and Payne's gray, I'm going to start by putting in some a little bit of brown. As soon as I turn it upside down, you can see that too, especially right over where the sunset is. The bottom of that cloud bank is much warmer than where it is at the top. And then as I go already, I started adding more Payne's gray into it and some blues. And it looks like my paper is still quite damp. I might not have the hard edge cloud bank that you're going to have in the reference photo, but again, that's okay. No one's the wiser. Cerulean blue, cobalt blue, making sure I'm getting that value in there. Look how soft that edge is, even after all this time. That sunset is creeping up into the cloud bank. So you don't have to get your paper sopping wet. Just with that sponge being damp, it takes a while for that to dry out so much that I'd be getting hard edges. Again, the benefits of working on 140-pound, a little bit softer paper. It's not quite as absorbent. That's neutral tint that I added, cobalt, cerulean blue. I'm just all over the place with my colors. I have no formulas really, but I'm just trying to get it so it looks, right. And it's very rare that I ever just grab a color out of my palette and start painting with it. Even when I was doing those yellows, you saw me pretty quickly going from cadmium lemon to quinacridone and then starting adding in pinks. And they're just more natural when you start blending them and merging them a bit than just using them right out of the tube. So if you kind of squint, again, if you just look at my painting, that looks maybe way too dark. But if you kind of squint at what I just did and then squint at the reference photo up above, and again, kind of compare that cloud bank to the white border of the photograph up there, you can see how much value you need to put in there so that it really pops it out. And this is the whole point of this, is making sure that that sunset is dramatic and really pops, okay? And if I go too weak with my other values around it, it's just not going to look bright. So that cloud bank was important. The land is going to be important later. That dark strip of land and some of those little dry brush trees, that's really going to make a difference in popping the sun on the bottom of the sky there too. So it's still so wet that even though I was lifting before with that little Chinese brush, I have to do it again. It's all kind of running back in there. So I'm just going to try and soften a little bit more of that. I have a paper towel in my hand. The sponge doesn't take off enough of the water. So I just kind of lift a little bit, wipe it on the paper towel, lift a little bit, wipe it on the paper towel. Every once in a while, you got to rinse it too to get some of that paint off. But I just continue to make sure that I'm getting some of that off of there. This must be really important because I'm actually videotaping myself doing that. Lift, there we go. So again, that's a synthetic, that's a really nice brush that I have in my hand right now, by the way. It's a Da Vinci brush, synthetic. I just ordered some more of those from Jerry's Artorama. They're nice brushes. They're really light. The handle is really light, and I don't know. It's just I love the marks that I can make with that little brush. I'm not even sure if I have a couple of real sable brushes that I'm even afraid to use because they basically stopped making good sable brushes. They're too expensive. It's too cost prohibitive. I don't even think you can find anything bigger than a size 6 in a sable brush anymore. The quest for good brushes is always continuing. Just keep pulling it off. As I pull it off, it might run back in a little bit, and I probably can't get it as light quite as I want it to, but that's okay. I'm just giving that a little bit more time before I turn it back right side up again, just to make sure that some of that dark wash, that my paper is still damp enough. I don't want it to run down too much. Well, that's another part of the reason why I'm lifting some of that water and paint off of that boundary, So when I turn my paper back over, hopefully that dark cloud won't creep down too much into the rest of the sky there.
So
All
Andy,
right.
this is Carol again, and I have another question.
Okay.
So when you, I think you'd said you wet the back of your paper in addition to the front of your paper for your
Yep.
painting? Okay, is that why your paper is not, because sometimes when I'll try and paint, if I don't, size my paper and tape it down, it'll buckle when I'm
Mhm.
painting with a lot of water.
Yep.
Is that why your paper is not buckling, because you have the water behind also the page, the
Exactly.
paper?
Yep. Exactly. It helps to keep it a little bit flatter on the table. When I wet just one side, it starts to curl up almost immediately. So by wetting both sides, I don't have to tape it down. Plus, it's only a quarter sheet. Every once in a while, a half sheet will, even though I wet both sides, it'll still buckle a little bit, but not too bad. Usually, what I do, the part of it is when you wet both sides, it kind of sticks down to the table. Okay. And then as it's trying to expand, sometimes it doesn't give it enough places to go. Even though I haven't stapled it down or taped it down, it's still kind of sticking to the table a bit. So every once in a while, I have to lift up if I'm working on a half sheet, I have to pick it up off the table and kind of pull on both sides of it and put it back down to try and keep some of that buckling under control. And that seems to work pretty well. But there's been maybe one out of every 15 or so paintings I might have to re-wet the back when I'm done and you know stack some books on it or something as it dries, so it'll flatten out a little bit. But for the most part, even the slight buckles will go away once you get a mat and a backing board and glass and stuff on it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Andy, we have one more question.
Okay, great.
Someone, Steve would like to know what size of brush you were using.
That little Da Vinci brush was a size 1, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name. I think it's not a petite gris, but it's something like that. It's a spin synthetic, I think is what it's called if you go to Da Vinci's site, but it's a size 1, which sounds ridiculous. I mean, the numbering of brushes is all over the place. You can't just go by the number and think it's standard. Some of the larger brushes, I've had squirrel mops that are size 6, and they're big mop brushes, and then you have a size 6 sable, and that's really small. And like I said, that one's a size 1, but if you compared it to a sable brush, it would be comparable to about a size 6 or 8 of a sable brush. But if you're looking for that little spin synthetic Da Vinci brush, it's a size 1.
And Andy, as long as you're on the brushes, is there any way you could post the Chinese brushes on, send it to us and we could put it on?
Sure. Yeah,
Okay.
I can do that. Yep.
I think people might be interested in that, but
Yeah, so
this,
those I'm not sure of the so when I was in China, I was there on one of those international watercolor trips, and Eugen Chisnikin, the Moldovan watercolor artist, he's pretty famous, and he's in Russia a lot, or in China a lot more than I am, and he loves their Chinese brushes. And we went to an art store, and he gave me some tips on finding the good ones. He said if they have just the white bristles, they're cheaper. But if they have at the tip of it, if they're darker hairs, so that means that the center of it is a different kind of a hair. He said those are the good ones. And I'm not sure. We were at an art store, and I could pick them up and see him, and I had him helping me, so I bought like 15 of those while we were there, and they were pretty cheap. But you can go on Amazon and just put in Chinese calligraphy brushes, and sometimes the image you'll be able to tell if it has that dark tip at the end of the brush. I think that's what he said you want to look for if you're getting a Chinese brush.
great, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, I'm just getting that small brush still. I need to try and probably drop in a couple of those little darker clouds with a small brush before it's dried too much. I still have that paper towel in my hand. I don't want to this has been drying on me, that lighter part of the sky, so I can't go in there with a brush that's too wet. So I mix the color that I kind of want, and obviously, you have to add some water in there to get it as light as you want it. but then I'll kind of dab it off every once in a while on a paper towel in my hand, just to make sure I'm not going to get blooms in that sky. Still trying to lift off some of those lights. It just keeps fuzzing back in there. That's all right. That's how damp that paper is, but that lets me know I can't even, I'm not even close to being able to paint those hard edges around that puddle yet, if that cloud is still fuzzing in that much. And I'm still able to put in a couple of these darker clouds and not worry too much about them creating issues. So those little dark clouds, that's actually kind of important too, that little shape. You wouldn't think so, but again, it's all about trying to get some nice contrast around that sunburst. And if it was just the pale cadmium lemon there, it doesn't quite have the effect. But by putting that little darker cloud close to that sunburst, that really does help to make it look brighter. And then obviously, like I said, later when I put the land in, that'll help quite a bit too. There's a few soft little undulations in the bottom of that cloud bank that I'm going to try and drop in right now as well. Bring that down. You can see where some of those little bit darker shapes are starting to come down into the light part of the sky. It's just tricky stuff. You practice, but it does help to have that paper towel in my hand to make sure that I'm really controlling the moisture that's in my brush. A little bit of Payne's Gray, a little bit more cerulean again. Just want a couple little slight variations up there, and those will soften up and fuzz too a little bit. You might not even notice them that much when all is said and done, but basically I'm just trying to work up there as long as I can to keep letting the ground plane give it some time to dry, because once I start painting that, it's going to be mostly hard edge shapes. I've got the buildings of the farm. I don't want those to fuzz too much, and around the puddle, I want to define the puddle. I don't want the snow to fuzz in there too much. So the longer I can just kind of work on that sky up there and give the ground plane a little bit more time to dry, the better. I can't remember if I had to actually kind of pause video here and use a hair dryer. I don't like to use a hair dryer if I can avoid it. Your paint looks much nicer if you just let it dry naturally than blasting it with a hair dryer to speed things up. But sometimes when I'm doing a demo, I don't have the luxury of just sitting there and letting it dry. So but I'm still using that little size 1 Da Vinci brush, thicker paint, not a lot of water. I'm going to start kind of testing things up there and see what happens. It's fun to work on these big dramatic skies. It's all about timing and consistency. What is my paper? You just kind of hold your breath sometimes while you're doing it and make sure that nothing bad happens up there, because it's awfully difficult to fix it. But I didn't like how pale that blue had dried. I wanted just a little bit more color up there to show that the light bottom of that cloud bank coming in. So I'm just softly merging that again, probably just finding something to do up there while I'm giving the ground plane a little bit more time. But that'll help a little bit too. Okay, so that nice, soft, colorful sky is in there, and you can see as it's starting to lighten up already now as it's drying and fading. But when I get the ground in, you'll really be able to see, once you have something else to compare it to, but other lighter colors, how much you, hopefully it's pretty close in value to what I really wanted there. I'm just working some cerulean blue in. Most of my little darker clouds are in there fine. I like the big cloud bank on top. I think that worked okay. And even leaving that, I wasn't sure about leaving that white paper right on the edge where the sun is, but the main thing is, if that was the only, big burst of color or light, it might not be a good idea to have it right on the edge, but it's going to be balanced by the puddle. in the middle of the painting there. So it won't just, hopefully the puddle and the power pole and the farm buildings and stuff will still keep the viewer's eye in the painting a little bit more and not going right off the page over there to the light sunset. So it's all going to be that middle value wash is almost all like I was talking about before, the white buildings, the white snow, quote unquote white. In this kind of a scene, in this time of day, there's a lot of value in it. Okay, I've got a lot of cerulean blue in those washes, some violets and pinks. It's going to mimic a lot of the colors that I used up in the sky, just darker versions of them as I come down there in the snow. But those buildings are almost the exact same value and color as the rest of the snow. So I can paint that big shape all together. And when I paint it, I'm going to come down through, I'll do those buildings and I'll paint down through the field, the darker field that's over on the top of the snow, or I'm sorry, on top of the puddle, and just kind of come on down and get the snow below it. And then once that's had more of a chance to dry, then I'll come in one more time and put the dark brown, plowed field on top of that, of this blue. So once again, going a lot to cerulean blue, some cadmium red, warm it up a bit. Those are both fairly opaque colors. So I don't want to get a real strong violet by using cerulean blue and cadmium red to mix it. It'll still be purplish, but it just really helps to take the edge off instead of using ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson to mix it. So I put a test mark down there. I didn't want to start painting right next to the puddle just in case it hadn't dried enough, okay? So when I'm starting to paint that, I'm going to put a couple marks down and see what happens. And I'll stay away from right at the edge of the puddle for now, just in case it's not, it hasn't dried enough. But it looks like it's not fuzzing too much, that first couple marks that I put on there, so I should be able to keep going. Pretty thick paint, not a lot of water in there. And again, the heaviness of cerulean blue and the cadmium red also helps. If they were lighter, more transparent colors, I'd have to use even more paint and less water. So that's almost the same color and value as that cloud bank above. And it just kind of gives the whole painting some nice harmony and unity if I'm using a lot of the similar colors in my palette to paint the whole thing. I don't have that many colors on my palette to begin with. I basically have 5 cool colors, a few earth tones, and then a little handful of reds and yellows with that lavender. So all that I'm putting in there now is the snow, basically. And there's going to be a couple of lighter patches of snow even up in that field that I want to get in. So just going to continue that all the way down. I'm still trying to stay away from, I don't want the land and the trees and the buildings to fuzz too much. So I'm going to avoid painting those for a little bit here and keep working on the snow down below. See, it was a little bit warmer down there too. Again, just like that little that cloud bank had some more warmth where it was right over the sunburst. The snow also down in that corner is a little warmer because it's reflecting a little bit more of the sunset on the right side. Just those little color shifts that you see if you pay attention can really make a difference in your paintings. Going from cool to just a little bit more warmth in areas. It keeps those big shapes from being too boring, number one, by adding a little bit of color shifts, but it also really lends kind of a subtle air of convincingness to the whole thing if you pay attention to those gradual color shifts. I'm still not defining that hard edge of the puddle really. I'm coming close to it, but you can see it's starting to fuzz a little bit there, which tells me my paper hasn't quite dried enough. So I'm not defining the actual edge of the puddle just yet. I'm getting close to it. I just have to keep letting it dry a little bit more. Definitely can't paint the buildings quite yet. It gets a little bit darker down there on that little corner of the road. So I've just added some browns and stuff to everything. You can start to get a sense of how light the sky is now that I'm starting to put some darker colors into. I've been painting a few sunsets lately. Some of these skies, just having fun with those. Even more brown down there in the corner. Some little clumps of dirt and stuff that I want to put in later. I might put a few of them in pretty soon, but again, those I want to be nice and kind of hard edged at the end of the puddle. So I might hold off just a little bit before I put some of those in. Every time I rinse my brush, I dab it off on that sponge, trying to control the amount of moisture in there. Now I'm using a smaller brush again to kind of lift because some of that violet did creep down a little bit, so I need to recreate some of the light on that puddle some there. Lift a little bit up and out. Lavender also has some white in it, more of an opaque color. So I'm just going to start warming it up. It's more of a, as it gets up there, you've got that, obviously the dark brown plowed field that'll be put in later, but even up at the top, I'm starting to add a little bit of warmth into that for the field as it's going up towards the roadside and the buildings up above. A little bit of raw sienna, even some reds, especially again on that right side where the sun is. I want that to be the warm area. Can barely
Andy?
see. Oh, sorry. Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, there's a question of what kind of brown are you using?
That's burnt sienna, and I put some raw sienna in it too. And you saw some. I even stuck my brush into some of the reds there, but really my only quote unquote brown is burnt sienna. On the top of it's hard to see, I know, but right above burnt sienna on my palette is neutral tint. I don't have anything like burnt umber or sepia or anything like that. Those are a little um, too dirty, I think. I don't know. I used to use sepia in my palette, but neutral tint is a really nice color. It's a dark, warm color that I use to kind of darken up my burnt sienna if I need to. So that's why I have it right up above my burnt sienna on my palette. Now you saw me throw even a little bit of blue in there as I'm going away from the sun. In that mixture, it's still mostly brown, but I'm even adding a little bit of cerulean blue and lavender in it instead of the red and raw sienna too much, to keep it a little bit cooler. That was that neutral tint I just went into up there, cerulean and cobalt blue. And it's a little bit lighter towards the sunset and a little bit darker away from it. I'm staying away from too much of the farm building still at this point, giving that as much time as I can to dry so that they don't fuzz too much. I should be able to hit it pretty soon, I think. Small brushes, just a little bit. Those puddles on my palette don't have a lot of water in them right now. I'm using the fact that my paper is still damp to make edges soft. See how much that the reflection of the silo had already fuzzed and lost. So I'm just putting that back in again. I just love to really take advantage of that wet paper. Trevor Chamberlain, I've talked about him a lot in my workshops and stuff. Anybody who's taken a class from me knows how much he's influenced me. Not, I've never, he doesn't teach and he doesn't do videos, but I love his paintings. And he's one of those British watercolor artists who really seems to get a nice combination of soft edges, lost edges, and then hard edges where they need to be. And he gets such a mood and an atmosphere in his paintings that I've tried to get in my own work. So the more I paint, the more I like to just, like I said, just kind of keep working on it and adjust things where I go as the paper's drying. And it takes practice when you're doing it. Watercolor is all about timing. How wet is your paper? How wet is my brush? You know, when can I come into this area? When do I have to stay out of that area? But the more you go, the more you do it, you start to make those adjustments. So now finally I'm starting to put in the white buildings, and you can see they're basically the same value and color as the snow. Like I said, they're not even close to white this time of day. I had to get some lavender and cerulean blue and stuff on them to make them look correct. But when I paint the darker trees and buildings around them, they'll look lighter. I know they're the darkest thing on the painting right now, the dark middle value, but there's other dark shapes to come. So that's a little grain elevator that I just kind of made up. And there's a grain elevator outside of town. You can't quite see it in this photo, but I know it's there. So I'm just putting it in or something else over there by the sunset. And again, if that fuzzed a little bit, it's one of the furthest shapes away in the distance. So it would have been okay if that was fuzzing a little bit into the sky. Because I'm using so much paint and so little water as I'm going on here, you see me really mixing that stuff up on the palette. There's a danger when you're just sticking your brush right into that pigment the way I'm doing to mix these thicker things, that you're going to get a chunk of paint on there when you start. So as I'm mixing these puddles, for lack of a better word, on my palette, even though there's hardly any water in there, I really push that brush around a lot just to make sure I'm not getting chunks of paint and pigment on there, and it's mixed well before I go to my paper. So now I can bring that field down a little bit. It's starting to dry, and I can start to define the top edge of the puddle a little bit. I stayed above it for a while. Like I said below, I didn't want, or previously, I didn't want that to start bleeding down into my puddle and ruining the sharp edge of it. So now as things are drying, I can start using thicker paint and do a little bit nicer job of defining the edge of that puddle. Trying to see. Looks like I've got 20 minutes left. Is that okay?
It's great.
Okay, good. An hour is not much time. I had to find a scene that it helped that I didn't have to do a value study. That speeds things up, and I didn't have to draw too much. That speeds things up. But you'll see almost the whole painting finished, hopefully, when all is said and done here. It's not bone dry. It's still fuzzing a little bit, but I like that. It's amazing how much before, when I used to work, I used to put a wash in and then walk away and let it dry, and come back and put another wash in and walk away and let it dry. Everything was so hard edged. I'm going to start bringing that snow down. Pretty soon I probably have to get a couple little reflections in there too of corn stalks and weeds and stuff. Make sure I'm bringing that down into it. And there's little dirt clumps and stuff along the front too. It doesn't have to be exactly like, the photo, obviously, but I try and get it close. So if you put that color in that I painted that bottom half of that painting on just white paper and told somebody that was going to be snow, snow and ice, they'd be, what? But in this context, in this time of day, in this subject, that's gonna look like snow. Seeing color as value is a tricky thing. Now finally I can start getting a little bit closer to the top of the landscape and it won't fuzz too much. So I'm using my finger there to soften things too. I do that all the time. It's a little bit safer than trying to get a wet brush and soften your edges, because a lot of times when you do that, you might have too much water on your brush and you start creating problems. So I just paint in there and use my finger to soften it and smudge it a little bit. So that's the lights, and the middle values are pretty much all done. The light sky, the light puddle, the middle value cloud bank, the middle value snow, the middle value farm buildings. So now I've got the dark plowed field, the dark silos, little dark clumps of dirt, that power pole that I want to really make sure the sky is dried before I put that in. That might be one of the last things I put in, but I think I can start working on the field pretty closely, because some of that can fuzz a little bit. I'm still using a smaller synthetic brush here. Again, just to make sure it's not holding too much water. Some little dry brush trees now. Don't put it on too dark. I just use my finger to soften it is all. Darken up that grain elevator a little bit better. That's a little too dark, soften it. But again, that shape was mostly to help, just like that little cloud does. It helps to show the drama of the sun a little bit more than just having nothing back there. So I'm working at that furthest area away. Again, kind of giving, because I just painted those light buildings. I don't want to paint the silos and the trees around it right away, because they'll just fuzz into them. So I'm giving those, that middle value kind of blue gray that I used for the buildings on the left, give it a little bit more time to dry, and I'll start working on areas on the other parts of the painting first. I want to try and give some of those, make some of those a little bit bigger, some a little bit taller, space them out randomly, have some variety. More Payne's gray and neutral tint as I get closer, even darker here. Just like I did with the puddle, I'll probably make a couple of marks and just kind of see what's happening. But I'm using so much paint now in my darker values that it shouldn't fuzz too much. It's mostly just paint on a little brush. Even if my paper is still damp, it's definitely not going to create a bloom or anything, because I barely have any water at all on my brush. Still just dry brushing trees around it. This is another thing that I talk a lot about in my courses. When it comes time to putting your darks in, a lot of times my students will start outlining their shapes. They take a little brush and they start drawing dark lines around their buildings to get them back. I tell them it's a big difference between drawing a line around a building and or a lighter shape to show it, and painting a shape next to it to highlight it. So I'm painting shapes of those darker trees around those buildings, not drawing a line around them, okay, to show them. It's a big difference. Avoid outlining if you can. Cobalt blue, cerulean blue, I'm going to start painting those silos pretty quickly. I can see if I can get some dry brush trees in there, that lets me know I'm probably okay to start putting some silos and stuff in. But now look at how much paint I had used on that sky, that sunset sky. Now that I'm starting to put darker values in there, look how pale that looks. You know, it's almost dry now, but I had to push those values on the sky earlier on to compensate for that. The last thing I would have wanted to do is go in after everything is done and try and go over that sky again and make it darker. I want to keep it nice and fresh. So when I was putting that silo in, I wanted to make sure, because I put its reflection in already, make sure you're putting that silo in where I put the reflection. That's important too. So I could still see my pencil marks there, but don't just put it in wherever. The dark brown in the field is going to be very important, obviously, to pop the light out on my puddle too. See how pale that snow is. It's not nearly enough to make that puddle look bright. A little bit more dry brushing, bigger trees over there. It's almost just paint on that little brush now. I don't think I've stuck my brush in the water in quite a while here. Again, no lines, painting a shape between the buildings, shadows. I'm so anxious to get that brown shape in. That's going to pop things so much. But everything has to its own time and place. Got to do all these little things. Again, that's the making sure that it's not going to fuzz in and ruin the shape of my puddle. So probably just giving that as much time as I can to dry. And all right, I've got that. Basically all the shapes on the horizon are done. Grain elevators, silos, dry brush trees, farm buildings. Make sure that, again, trying to pay attention that there's a little bit of variety in heights and spaces between things and all that kind of stuff. It's real easy to get symmetrical and uniform with things and start painting the same shape all the time. All right, here we go. Mixing a lot of dark colors with a bigger brush. Time for the field. Make that puddle pop. Burnt sienna, Payne's gray, cerulean blue again, just because of the snow, take the edge off. I want to make sure that so I put that little test mark there again, just not right on top of the puddle. I don't want to do that there and then have it be fuzzing too much and not be able to fix that. So if my first mark I make is not right on top of the puddle, it's away from it a little bit, testing the water, so to speak, and see what's happening. And if it's still dry brush and staying put, now I know I can continue on and keep painting that. I'm going to try and leave a couple little spots of snow showing through from that medium value wash as I paint that field up above. It's tricky when you have a big dark shape like that because you have to, you can see there's a little bit more water on my palette now. I'm using a bigger brush too, but you can't thin it, too much or it doesn't get dark enough. But it's such a big shape to paint, I can't just use a small brush and all paint, or I'm just going to make a series of small little dry brush marks. So I stand when I paint. You can see up there in the picture in picture, so that when I'm making these brush strokes, I can use my whole arm and cover more territory. If you sit when you paint, it's just so much harder to make those kind of real quick strokes like that, those dry brush strokes. I can work from my shoulder when I'm putting these shapes in now. But now you've got that contrast of the dirt above the top of that puddle. Really makes it pop out nicely. Kind of squint your eyes every once in a while at the screen and just kind of get a sense of how the values are working and the shapes and stuff. It's not about all the little details. It's always about the big stuff. We tend to worry about all the little things in our paintings, but I stand and I'm squinting a lot. I've got my cheaters on while I'm doing the painting a lot, but I have my glasses on just to see things once in a while, but I half close my eyes for 90% of the painting while I'm doing it, just to stay focused on big shapes and values. Getting nice and dark down there now with the dirt clumps. Leaving a little bit of snow behind. Those little guys in the front too help to pop the light on the puddle out. Same thing. I want some to be longer, some shorter, change the shape of them a little bit. It's harder than it sounds to get some of that variety in there. So I just use my fingernail to scrape out the bottom of that power pole. It's a little bit lighter in front of the dirt and then darker in front of the sky. So while that was still wet, I can always, if it lightened it up too much, I can come back there and fill it in later. But instead of trying to paint around it, I just painted through it, gave it a couple minutes to dry a little bit and just took my fingernail and scraped that shape out. That's so much easier than trying to paint around everything. Starting to get some nice drama and contrast in here. I've got everything from white paper down to almost pure paint down there in the dirt clumps and everything in between on this scene. But that's what you need if you're going for the contrast of a sunset. A little bit of dry brushing. My paper, if I picked up that paper, I bet you would still just kind of hang there like it was still half damp. Um, it won't be dry for a while, but I'm using enough paint on there now that it's still giving the illusion of some dry brushing shapes. I love painting scenes like this. This is just, I grew up in rural Wisconsin and lived in the cities for a while when I first moved to Minnesota and I was going to school and stuff, but I've lived down here in Vermilion for well over 20 years now. And it's just familiar to me, these kind of scenes. I know there's not a lot going on. I've gotten better at painting skies the longer I've lived out here because there's not much blocking the sky down here. But you tend to start to find interest in other things, and I can find the beauty in a little puddle reflecting the sunset over a horse-drawn carriage in Amsterdam or something. I had to darken that bottom corner and change the value from the road to the snow. The snow was definitely a little bit lighter than the road, so had to come over that a bit again. Getting pretty close to done here. I'm just darkening that up. I think in the last 5 minutes here, I'll be just kind of adding a little bit of variety into the snow, and then I'll put in that power pole and a couple of power lines quickly and wrap it up. And I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer if there's questions afterwards too. Don't worry about it. I had to get a clear spot of everything was starting to get a little bit muddy on there, but I haven't changed my water yet. I just keep using the colors that are on my palette as I go to. It's rare that I wipe everything off and kind of start from scratch. I had to get a little bit of variety in that puddle. There was some the clouds and stuff are reflecting in there a little bit too. There we go. One more photo, and I think I'm going to turn it sideways. I like to, if I'm going to do that shape of the power pole and the power lines and stuff, it's a lot easier to turn my paper sideways and upside down when I'm doing those shapes. And just because what I just painted was all, normally I would want to start at the bottom of that power pole and work my way up to the sky, but I would have been dragging my hand through a lot of the stuff that I just painted there. So that sky has been drying a lot longer than the ground plane. So I had to turn my paper this way. So as I kind of rest my hand a little bit, I'm not going to be, wiping it right through everything I just painted there. Small synthetic brush. I'll try and just kind of make it nice, and there's no way it's going to be perfectly straight, but that's okay. Straight enough. But I rest my hand on the table and just kind of go for it, keeping in mind where I left the little light area down below it. Okay, it was important that that lined up. And people ask me all the time, why'd you put that power pole in there? Why do you have the power lines in there? But without that, it's all just, especially out here, like I was saying, where it's so flat, you don't have many tall shapes at all. So if there's a tree or a power pole or something that can help break all those long horizontal shapes, I put them in. It's part of our landscape, especially the little power lines and stuff as they kind of weave in and out of the painting. Those are fun lines too to have in there. So I don't always put them in, but I don't leave them out on purpose because they're ugly or something. Just a few more clumps of dirt, darken up a couple more areas. Nice and dark right over the puddle. Really make sure that's popping. A little bit more dry brush now that it's dried some to show that plowed dirt field. But if you worry about the big shapes and not all the little stuff, you can get a painting done in an hour. There's some little things in there, but I paint what I see when I squint. I'm trying to just give the impression, get that light. I didn't take this reference photo or paint this scene because I loved the fences and the windows on the farm buildings. Okay, they're just distant shapes. Worry about the big important things. Let some of that small stuff, the viewer's brain can just figure that out. So I've got a small synthetic brush, quick little brush stroke or two for the power lines going down. And I turn my paper upside down because those things kind of sag down, and that's the natural motion your arm makes when you're making those quick brush strokes. So got a few power lines in now too, and that just kind of helps break everything up and give a sense of depth to everything. You can see that in there, zooming in there. But that's pretty much the finished painting. Sunset with a melted puddle of ice reflecting it.